we have lots of definitions of love these days, and people often say it's not about the feeling. Love is not, it's not a feeling, and it isn't. Love is actually the nature of the universe. But when that kind of love arises that is actually awakens you, that's a feeling. So that was my beginning, and took about 1.5 years before I started actually seeking. And when I did, it was very, very dramatic. I just left everything to do a 3-month spiritual training. When the training was over, I felt as though I couldn't go back to my normal life, that I had to pursue this.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Steve Stein. I'm the founder of Better Listen and Wisdom Feed, and most recently, also the host. We did some summits, the Surfing the Tsunami of Change Summit series early in the pandemic. That's the first time I worked with Sally, and really excited to be here again. Sally Kempton is nationally recognized as a master meditation and tantric philosophy teacher, a former Vedic Swami. She has been teaching for a long time and is known for her practical insights into spiritual life and for her powerful transmissions of meditative states. Sally is the author of Awakening Shakti and best-selling meditation for the love of it. Welcome, Sally.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome, everyone.
Okay, so Sally, I think we spoke yesterday. So where were you born? I mean, just how did you kind of find your way into this whole spiritual business?
Well, it was a big departure from my background. I was born in New York. I grew up in Princeton, New Jersey. My family were left-wing humanist. My father was a journalist, and I kind of was brought up to be a journalist. And when I was in my 20s, I worked at various New York media outlets, starting with the Village Voice, then Esquire, the New York Times, not their daily paper, but the Sunday papers in the magazine, New York Magazine. And there was, my actual entrance onto the spiritual path happened rather typically for my generation. I had taken acid with a new boyfriend, and we were sitting on my couch when several of you here heard this story before. When all of a sudden the room was filled with love. And it was very clear to me in that moment that this was not acid. This was the truth about the universe. And I turned to my boyfriend and I said, "There's only love." And he said, "Haven't you ever taken acid before?" So I felt rather deflated, but it was also clear to me that this was a revelation of an important kind. And I would say, I think the thing that was most radical about it was that I had never experienced love like this before. And, in retrospect, I would say that I had never experienced this feeling of complete heart-melting love, which was what I believed love was supposed to be about. I mean, we have lots of definitions of love these days, and people often say it's not about the feeling. Love is not, it's not a feeling, and it isn't. Love is actually the nature of the universe. But when that kind of love arises that is actually awakens you, that's a feeling. So that was my beginning, and took about 1.5 years before I started actually seeking. And when I did, it was very, very dramatic. I just left everything to do a 3-month spiritual training. When the training was over, I felt as though I couldn't go back to my normal life, that I had to pursue this. And I began teaching in that tradition. And then about a year and a half later, I met my teacher, Swami Muktananda, who was traveling in the West on his second world tour. I met him in Los Angeles. And I went to see him because I was having Kundalini experiences that I didn't understand. And I had heard that he was a Kundalini master. So I actually went to him for advice. And in the course of that weekend, I just had a huge bang opening of my heart, similar to the experience I'd had on acid. And that was kind of a convincing moment.
Only this time you weren't on acid, right?
And this time I wasn't on acid, but I was with him. And so I did something that a lot of people do, which is I associated the inner feeling with the person who had, it seemed to me, kindled it, which indeed I believe he had. And though he was continually saying, the love you feel in my presence is your love, and though I now know that that's absolutely true, at the time, it seemed to me that it was his love. He was giving me love, and I couldn't do it without him. You know, I certainly wasn't going to go around being pickled on acid all the time. So I became his student, which was a pretty rational decision. You know, if you want to be on a spiritual journey, you find a teacher. But I also became, let's say, his spiritual dependent, which is one of the ways we understood the guru-disciple relationship. It's one of the ways my generation certainly understood the guru-disciple relationship, which sort of throw yourself at this being's feet, and then they would download their state into you. You would do whatever was necessary, whether it was meditating or serving, or the various spiritual practices you could do. But basically, in the tradition that I was engaged in, spiritual progress was the result of grace, and it came from the teacher or higher powers. So I had very powerful experiences of grace during the years I was with him. And at a certain point, I began to, let's say, mature, and to actually recognize that the external contact with him, beautiful as it was, thrilling as it was, and it often was, he was a big personality person, that whatever the outer experience with him was, that the inner experience was mine, and that it couldn't be taken away as long as I kept turning to it. So that's kind of the gist of it. And I stayed in that organization for almost 30 years. I became a monk. I learned to be a teacher in that tradition, which is, I call it devotional contemplative tantra, which is pretty much what I teach, though not in the way of that spiritual organization. And I left in 2000, partly because I wanted the intellectual freedom of teaching my own understanding.
Right. I have a question for you. So
Sure.
If we backtrack a little bit, so you went to see, you in LA, you were in the presence of Swami, and it was a kind of a life changer, a game changer. Now, up until that, you were writing not only for the Village Voice, for the New Yorker, and
Not the New Yorker.
what were you writing about? Were you writing about anything metaphysically at all related? No. So what were you writing about?
I was writing about rock music, about the downtown art scene a lot. That was kind of my beat. I interviewed film directors and movie stars, and I covered left-wing politics. And the women's movement. I wrote a piece about my experience of the women's movement. But I was basically a cultural writer, essentially a countercultural writer, as we used to say in those days. And no, spirituality was not in my wheelhouse. In fact, my friends and I used to make fun of it. So, it was really quite a big revelation.
Interesting. So that's part of there's different parallels and different similarities. In kind of my journey, I was never a writer in that level, but so the counterculture, so part of what I'm trying to do, what I'm doing with Wisdom Feed, and I've been publishing audiobooks for many years with Better Listen is the audio label I've been doing for a number of years. And it's kind of try to take ancient ideas down to street level, try to, kind of digest it. And I think there's a kind of a spiritual element in anything creative, but it seems like it struck a nerve. And then for me, I was thinking of my past. I did get Shaktipad from Mutkananda, totally kind of in a graceful way, totally by accident. But I also saw the Grateful Dead many times. So I was thinking that, in some ways was Jerry Garcia I'm not trying to make light of it, but it was an experience. And I think there's a community aspect of it that I think it's just compelling. So you were writing with all these people, and were you actually writing about were you covering it for a story when you came upon Mutkananda?
No. I left New York. I was living in Los Angeles. I was teaching in this spiritual group. I had really stepped out of my journalistic career. I was about to step back into it when I met Muktananda. And then he sort of derailed me completely from my previous life.
All right. So now I kind of personally, I have kind of a picture of how you got there. And then, so you kind of, the other thing is, my goal is to try to transfer these ideas to my friends from Brooklyn. The people that I grew up with, a lot of them never meditated, but yet I know that if it can be translated into kind of, the name of our podcast is StreetSmart Wisdom, into a street level for the vernacular. And you know what? I used to make fun of this stuff also. And then all of a sudden you found yourself deep into it. So the next question I have, so now you're doing contemplative Tantra. You're kind of, that's your genre, so to speak. And why did you do that? Did you feel compelled to doing it, or, why didn't you go back to writing, so to speak?
Well, I did continue writing. That's what I did when I was living with Swami Muktananda, and then later on I was a teacher, which for me involves writing. So I never stopped writing. I actually, this is a heretical thing to say, I actually just lost interest in the kind of writing I had been doing, and realized that I had not ever actually been that interested in it to begin with. In other words, it was always a problem for me trying to live up to the successful worldly life that I was expected to follow, and that I was very much offered the opportunity to follow. So, but it did not really excite me. It didn't touch my heart. And spirituality was actually the first thing I had come across that excited me, that made me feel connected, that was something I was interested in, that was something I was willing to give my life to, that I was willing to sacrifice for, that I was willing to work for. All those things, once it became clear that was what my life was about, then I kind of never looked back. And I certainly have attempted to make spiritual wisdom accessible to so-called normal people. And I think it's unbelievably worthwhile and important, but not at the level where you have to argue whether spirituality is worth pursuing, because my view is if you think it's worth pursuing, then, then I'm interested in talking to you. If you don't think it's worth pursuing, you don't need to talk to me. Unless you happen to be my cousin, in which case I'm very happy to see you.
I don't think we're cousins. We might be, but I don't think we are.
No, I don't think we are.
So, got it. So I think I know the question. So now I kind of have a continuum and of how you got here. So, and why you do it, I think you explained, because it's compelling and it became your truth to do that. So, and I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you were a superhero, what would be your origin story? What set you on this path?
Wow. That's an interesting question. I don't have an immediate answer to it.
Right. I think when you described the LSD was a kind of a catalyst,
Yeah.
And
well, I should say I've never considered myself a superhero. I've never been interested in being a superhero. My métier is more heartfelt romance. So if you asked me, who I fell in love with, and I told you, I could tell you I fell in love with Shiva, that would be more true to my experience. In other words, my interest is in devotion, it's in affection, not so much in heroic deeds. And I'm not the kind of teacher, nor am I the kind of seeker that attempts heroic spiritual interventions. So, I know a lot of people, mostly guys, but some women too, who kind of go, I'm on the spiritual path. I'm hell-bent for enlightenment. I'm doing austerities. I only believe that consciousness is real. Nothing is real except consciousness. I won't hear any other viewpoint. That's what I would call the spiritual hero position, the Buddha position. I'm going to sit under the Bodhi tree until I'm realized. So Tantra is not, although it's a little bit misleading to make any kind of generalization about Tantra, but my experience of Tantra is that it's a tradition which recognizes the sacredness of your life, as well as the sacredness of the higher realms. So there's a natural recognition that, though it's certainly not specific in the Hindu and Buddhist tantras, but there's a general recognition that you have to really cure the wounds and misunderstandings of your life, along with spiritual heroism.
That's
so
beautiful. Wow, that's
and
gorgeous.
I think that's why Tantra is becoming more and more a mainstream these days, especially with the millennials and the Gen Z people, because they get that, spirituality makes no sense if you're not somehow connected to the sacred nature of the body and of the world.
Wow. So how would you define Tantra? I mean, I think you just did, but just, I know it's kind of a traditional sense, but the way you're describing it is much more connected than any way I've thought about it previously.
Well, the scholars of Tantra basically define Tantra as what tantric practitioners say about themselves. In other words, it's a very big, very wide tradition. And it's essentially, again, there are many different schools of Tantra, but the school of Tantra that I'm connected to is non-dual. In other words, the understanding is that there is nothing that is not made of God, if you will. And that therefore nothing is to be rejected. In other words, nothing is to be completely put out of your heart, your sense of reality. But at the same time, Tantra is full of protocols. It's full of what we might call different forms of spiritual etiquette. So it's not like it's a complete the traditional Tantra is not a complete wash, of undifferentiated, spiritual enthusiasm. It's a very specific path with a lot of very specific practices. But essentially, the understanding is that every atom and molecule within you and around you is an appearance within God, and the appearance is totally imbued with the quality of its source. So there's nothing outside of the divine.
God, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
That was amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. So I was going to ask, and you kind of answered it as you were speaking. So Tantra and Zen, do they have anything to do with each other, like being present in the moment, or is it more of a universal connectedness, or is it the other side of the same coin? Or
it's an interesting question. Zen, of course, is all about the present moment, and Zen is very down to earth. Tantra tends to be, and it's sort of the difference between Indians and Japanese people. In India, there's a tremendous fascination. Again, I forgive the generalizations here, but there tends to be a recognition of the different spheres of reality, different levels of consciousness. There's a lot of interest in higher realms. There's a lot of interest in subtle beings, deities, and, what we would call angels. Whereas in Zen, it's very much, okay, we're here now. Did you wash your bowl? Sit with your face to the wall and count your breaths and be fully present. And, don't give me any of that bullshit about higher realms. And I don't care about your visions either. It's a profound tradition. I've practiced in it. I have infinite respect for it. It's just a different style.
Well, I'm glad I asked, because I didn't, I knew there was different, but now I see how. And then as we kind of close out this section, so you said there's great interest in Tantra with with younger people now?
Yeah.
How does that manifest, or why do you think that is?
Well, it's been a sort of interesting progression, because my teacher, Swami Muktananda, was one of the first people outside of the, the very small community of scholars at places like Banaras Hindu University, who actually brought the teachings of what, we sometimes call Kashmir Shaivism. Technically, it's called Trika, non-dual Shaivism. He introduced it to his students. A lot of his students kind of cross-pollinated it in the academic world, and they weren't the only ones. And there was their teacher, whom I think most of you have heard of, who died in the 80s, called Lakshman Ju, who was considered to be the last traditional teacher of this lineage. And he had a number of academic students who went to work at places like Oxford and Harvard, and, translated the texts. So, and this all started in the early 70s. So there's been a process of Kashmir Shaivism becoming more and more popularized. There are some European teachers like Jean Klein who taught a version of it. Jean Klein's students include Richard Miller and Francis Lucille and Rupert Spiro, who they basically teach the principles of Tantra, though they're all more Advaita Vedanta in their preoccupation. So it's kind of branched out from the center. It's becoming more and more known, especially in certain parts of the yoga world. It's very congruent with yoga because there's honor for the body, which other traditions are not so body positive. And it fits in very well to the recognition that a lot of spiritual practitioners have, that it's important to be an activist at this time in life, that it's not enough to have a strong meditation practice. You actually have to share it, and you have to work with this screwed up world to try to make it better. So in that Tantra gets that. Tantra allows that.
Wow. No, so that I think is probably, we can maybe do a couple of minutes of questions if people want to drop in or unmute yourself, but just for a couple of minutes, or drop a few questions in, or we can just go right to the next section. Either or. Okay, Jackie, you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Jackie.
I'm wondering if this is appropriate for you to give a little ad for your upcoming
You're inviting me to go to
class. I'm inviting you to talk about your next class.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Jackie. So briefly, I'm teaching a class called Your Mind is Your World, which is based on a text of Vedanta called the Yoga Vashista. It's a wild and crazy account of the teachings of a sage, filled with stories, filled with a very, very radical view of the nature of reality. And the Yoga Vashista is one of those texts that says absolutely nothing is real except consciousness. So it appears to be a little bit of the opposite of what I've just said, but it's an extraordinary piece of work for getting you to actually move past being stuck in the physical. So, and in what we often say is that the first stage in this process is recognizing that consciousness, awareness, this incredibly subtle stuff, is the source and the heart of everything. And then once you've really realized that position, and this, meaning what's often called enlightenment, once you become enlightened in that position, then you naturally see that the whole world is filled with the Shakti, that is the power aspect of consciousness. And so the Yoga Vashista is really the background of what you do to cook yourself in non-dual teachings. And it's, it also has a capacity to take you into very, very deep states of nirvikalpa samadhi. I'm not promising that will happen in this course, but it's got that capacity.